All right, this is the node.js API working group meeting, November 19th, 2015. And we have a few regulars on the call. I think everyone's been on the call so far. There was one person who just dropped off, though. Hopefully he'll make it back. Robert Paveza. So, let's see. I think everybody has been on the call before, and so we kind of know who you are. If not, please speak up right now. Oh, there's Robert again. Yep. Hey, Robert. Hey. I was just asking for anybody who's has not been on the call before. Were you on the call last week? I don't recognize.
I was not.
Oh, okay. Or I'm sorry, a month ago.
Right.
You want to just, everyone else has, you can go back and look at the previous YouTube to get a little statement on everybody. But if you want to just say something briefly, if you want to, that would be awesome.
Okay, sure. I'm Rob Paveza. I work at Microsoft. We're particularly interested in Node, and at least my charter is specifically interested in Node and making Node run well in general, and also particularly about native module extensibility. So obviously, why this working group is going on. So that's why I'm here.
Great, welcome.
Thanks.
So I thought what do is if you look at the issue, and this the issue for this meeting is in the Node.js repo in the API repo in the Node.js org at GitHub, issue number 11. And I kind of summed up the agenda items as I saw them into the Google Doc that's linked at the beginning. So just kind of real briefly, Oguz had kind of brought up two separate issues. Somewhere I can't remember where I even got these, but I figured they were kind of chunky enough that they'd be worth having him talk about a little bit anyway. So there's those two things. There's a new issue that got created. I think it was after the last call. It's issue 10, Native Modules API, the FFI approach from Alexis. So maybe you can give us some status there. And then I added just a final item, next steps, to have us start thinking about some standalone kind of chunky bits for people to have something to kind of work on, iterate on. And pulled up two different things that kind of showed up here, data types, of which there's a document already, and prototype building API and lower level API. So maybe we can just chat about that. Great. I see somebody's editing the doc as we speak. And there's Trevor as well. Hey, Trevor.
Hey, what's up?
Just mention the agenda items that are in the Google Doc for us to have a discussion about today. So I guess we'll start with Oguz. I'm sorry if I'm must be mispronouncing one of those. Yeah. Get started on those things in the agenda. And there's somebody who's kind of noisy. If they want to mute.
That's me. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay. After the first meeting, I thought about the general priorities. For example, at the beginning of the meeting, Robert also mentioned the same problem about the native C++ add-ons, actually. So there are two sort of kind of problems we can solve here. The first one is the private, like internally what we can do in order to, for example, reduce the amount of work switching between the different engine versions. For example, upgrading to V8 to the next version instead of updating every single side of the code, internal code. We can just update the proxy, shimming, whatever it is, and it will be much more easier probably. So this is the first thing, internal side, and the other problem is public, like the native add-ons, etc. It could be really nice to have this problem solved for many people, probably. For example, upgrading from... actually, there are solutions right now trying to solve this problem, especially for node.js itself, like none, for example. But it could be nice to have a solution. So using that solution, people could have much more option without breaking entirely their solutions, modules. For that reason, and most importantly, for example, last meeting, I remember there was a subject something like, if we update the node in a way, it will allow all the JavaScript engine, etc. That wouldn't be Node.js. So in this case, if we just target the public API, there is no need to argue, discuss all about the different JavaScript engines, etc., etc. We could simply focus on a public API with its own types, etc. And maybe we can solve a very big problem. And it would help us and many others. That's the thing I wanted to bring.
So in terms of kind of trying to find some things for us to kind of like focus on a little bit more, separate issue, well, as issues, but as a GitHub issue, but sort of a particular thing to focus on. It seems like maybe actually having an issue that is, you know, kind of focused on a particular thing. In this case, I just don't. I'm not keeping up with the terminology enough here in terms of public API. When we talk about API, there's kind of different APIs we're talking about, and so it would actually be good to have an issue that was kind of very focused and said, you know, here's a problem we're trying to solve, and the use of the term API can be very specific to that issue. Describe some examples, for instance, whether it's an existing built-in node.js module, you know, provide some examples there, or if we're talking about native modules and the API that goes with them and changes every release. So that might be kind of a good thing to do, and that way we can actually kind of have a conversation about that particular thing in the issue and kind of be laser focused on what exactly is going on there. I feel like that might be a better way for me anyway to kind of keep track of what's going on. So I suspect it would also be a good way for folks, for instance, outside of this group, who might end up being interested in it as kind of a stepping stone for them as well, to be able to kind of figure out what is going on here. Does that sound
Yeah, sounds
okay?
good.
Okay,
Sounds
great. Now, did your previous discussion, did that actually take both of your points in the agenda into account? The second one had to do with JX Core.
Yeah, actually, right now we finalized implementing Chakra. And nothing changed for any application embedding JX Core inside. Nothing changed. Like this, okay, it can be definitely improved. It can be much better. But hey, there is a way we can achieve this. I mean, it's not a rocket science. At least this working group has lots of good developers, and maybe there are even better approaches. So this is something I'm just trying to say. This is there is a problem. Everybody has some kind of everybody has some part of this problem. Like for example, the multiple engine issues. Like we are not able to target the node modules using SpiderMonkey or Chakra. Or with Chakra, it requires recompilation, okay, but with SpiderMonkey it's not possible because the API is totally entirely different. On the other hand, there are other platforms, different node.js versions, etc. This is a very big issue. We can solve this issue. I believe that was my point, and there is a solution. I mean, it works. If, for example, if someone says, "Hey, so what is the solution?" Hey, this is a solution. I mean, there can be. Is it possible to make it better? Yeah, of course.
So, but I guess what I was wondering is when you were talking public API, which is I think where where Patrick started to onto is the definition of what you meant by that. I thought you might have meant that that's the node, the public API that's given to node modules.
Definitely.
So that's what you meant, and I guess is what you're saying that, you know, in what you have today, you've actually defined one version of what that public API might look like.
Yep.
So I guess the next thing I think then is to say, you know, you could start by proposing that would be the public API that we would propose to modules, and use that as the basis for discussion.
Actually, initially, it is proposed, and the data types for a possible public API is already documented. I mean, in a very basic version on this repository.
Right. But I mean, I guess it sounds like you're saying we have something which is working. If we had a full definition of what that public API was, we could then consider whether, you know, that's what we would want to propose or make some tweaks to it.
Okay. So in other words, yeah, there we have the data types, but it could be nicer to have all of them.
I guess I'm thinking like we would need to have a full API definition of what it is today, you know, what methods you can use, the data types, everything, because that's what we would have to give to people. And if we have a working version, the rest of the people in the meeting can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like a very concrete way to have the discussion.
Okay, sounds good.
Right, and you know, I can imagine that surfacing in a bunch of different ways, right? So it could be code, which is some sort of kind of shim, or you know, almost kind of like a mock version of the Node APIs, or maybe it's some kind of structural definition. Could be TypeScript, or it could be JSON schema. I hope not, but you know what I'm saying. So I think I have no idea like what would even kind of make sense, but I sort of feel like we probably won't know until we actually start trying and see what we got.
I think the current one, if I understand, is probably written in C or C++.
Yeah.
You know, if this is a wrapper around V8, it's probably a set of C functions that you can call along with the data types that go with it.
No, actually, this is not a wrapper around the V8, but this is a layer sort of on front of. Right now, it works on front of JX Core. Like you can even either embed your the whole binary into your application, native application, C, C++, Objective-C, whatever. Or there is a possibility, I mean, by couple of tweaks, by using couple of tweaks, it can be used for modules also. We are not right now pushing anything, hey, you can use this way in order to develop JX Core native modules, because it's not supported by Node, and it's kind of pointless for us to bring something, and eventually, let's say somebody developed using this API, somebody developed some native module for JX Core using this API, is pointless because that person won't be doing any good for Node.js side, right? It will be only working for JX Core. So that's why right now it's not available, or it's not open for embedding another module into JX Core, but it is reversible.
Right, but is it a good starting point for an API? There's an API that modules use for native the native modules use. Is it a good starting point for that, for defining an API which would, have a standard interface that we wouldn't change?
Well, I think the struggle that we have now is that the API that modules do use is V8.
Right.
And that's the moving target that makes things difficult. So, yeah, I think I heard earlier that the suggestion was like we kind of maybe go through. I don't think the word was audit, but that's kind of what's in my head, is that we go through and audit the V8 APIs and determine from there. I don't know. Maybe we take a look at the top 10, top 20 native modules, figure out what they're commonly using, use that to target a set of more abstract APIs that become the set of blessed APIs that those modules can call, and then that becomes an abstraction over the core set.
Well, that still leaves you short. I mean, say in one of those top 10 or 20, you have a JavaScript API with a native counterpart that doesn't exist in Shocker or SpiderMonkey yet. Therefore, it forces it not to exist. Like, you're going to have limitations regardless.
It might be the case that the 80-20 rule kind of works here. So I mean, imagine where we do have sort of some kind of abstraction layer that actually works for 80% of the natives, and somehow is doesn't use any more memory or time, in a realistically than, or much more than V8 would, that would make it an interesting target for some number of natives. It doesn't mean that becomes the API. Maybe it's a portable API that you can use with V8, but you can always go right to V8 directly if you want to, right? And realize you're paying a cost there as well, right? But there's also a cost in even this native layer, since V8's an abstract native layer, since V8 is changing all the time. So I mean, it seems to me like that's an interesting.
Right there, I think is one thing we need to take into account, right? Before we brainstorm all we want, but unless like the CTC says, yeah, we'll go for it, it's a no-go. And if it comes with performance overhead, which we're fighting already, then it's very unlikely to be accepted.
So I mean, the suggestion that we had made, and I think Alexis had started on this, and I had elaborated a little bit with issue number 10, was that it's possible that we don't need to actually implement this API in terms of actual C functions, but rather using macros and templates. So that, depending on how closely the shim layer mirrored, or this API that we're providing mirrored the V8 API, the performance penalties would be next to nothing, because they're just directly forwarding or substituting V8 API calls inline, and if those are native call or native shims, basically it's a zero cost. Whereas if Chopper or SpiderMonkey wants to implement those, yeah, maybe it's a 2 or 3 C function call cost, or something has to happen where we're mutating our state in order to switch over to be the API level compatibility with V8 as it is today. But the flip side is then that's the cost that we pay for play, and maybe we see a future where we can change the way that the API is shaped or something to that effect to allow us to move forward with better performance. Or it advises our API design. We say that this call is costing a lot of overhead. Let's provide a native function from Chakra that does the same thing. Then we can change the API under the covers without it, and just get the performance win.
So do we want to then create another issue with a little bit of concrete-ish focus on what the problem we think is and how we'll address it, and then we can kind of start playing from there?
One thing, actually, I made this research long before, and by every single new engine coming, I find myself doing this research again and again. So I think the set of, I'm talking about maybe most important 60%. The set of methods, API methods, and the data types are not a big deal. But the rest, maybe like the 80-20% approach, maybe this extra 20% on top of 60% will be tricky. Maybe we may need to make additional research on that. But I don't know if this approach would force any modules, especially in terms of performance. I don't think so. Of course, it depends the difference among the engines. But for example, let's say one of the most basic things. Hey, carry this string to the JavaScript side. Create this object. Check if this property is available under this particular object. Add another property. Like this sort of stuff. Most of the API based on this stuff, like basic C methods, or most preferable C methods actually.
Yeah. So if you said you've done that research before, maybe you can just post it as an additional file in the repo. Yeah. By the data types one that's already out there. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, all this work has been done and it's up and running. I think this part is quite doable, but perhaps the next 20% or even more needs to be separately discussed, or we need to find a way to implement them among the different versions, of course.
Yeah, it sort of seems to me like if we actually find even a case where it's 40%, it's sort of like, hey, there are a couple modules that could actually be built with this super simplified API that would be easy to implement in a bunch of different native API that would be easy to create for a bunch of different engines. At least that gives us something to kind of play with and see if this is even has legs, right? Because
okay, so I feel like we're treating this as like the most immediate need, but this is also like the most complex path that we could possibly take before anything gets done, before we have anything we can show or release. This right here, what we're discussing, is going to be the most complicated to do, because it's not only like getting the code. It's also like the whole part of the community. I mean, you say 20%. Well, 20% of 50,000 modules is a heck of a lot of modules that are not going to work with this, right?
Are there 50,000 native modules?
I can provide some data. I have some data in the.
I know I'm overshooting, but I was thinking of modules and then modules that depend on modules.
Well, right now, no modules are going to work with it anyway, right? Because no modules are actually going to use this new API that we're creating. So that's I mean,
But see that okay, so that introduces another level of complexity. That means that V8 will technically be abstracted from the JavaScript layer, but at the same time, we're going to have the V8 API that works through the abstraction layer to the like. We have multiple abstractions and APIs going on at the same time. This is just getting really complicated.
No, actually, by 60%, I was talking about the necessary API, not the modules. And I believe most of the modules are not using the rest 40%. Right now, I do understand the part, the 80-20 part, and in terms of 80-20 part, I think only maybe 10% of the modules wouldn't be functioning properly. Like, for example, level down, for example, it's very complicated. It's using most tricky part of the V8. And while I was converting it for mobile, and I checked, okay, we have all the necessary stuff on the public side. So this can be implemented using a public API, like without any non-breaking public API. So if this is the case for level down or SQLite module, I think this is the case for many others.
Yeah, so I kind of feel for everyone here. I've been kind of in this space before, back when I was with IBM. Hi, Michael Dawson. And in other languages, not in Node, having this kind of same issue, and I can feel Trevor's pain quite a bit. Right? It's not just getting some code to work. There's all kinds of other community issues and stuff like that. It's a potentially interesting approach. There's a lot of work that has to be done. And if folks are interested in it, I'm certainly I'm interested in following it and help out as much as I can. But to Trevor's point, I'm going to treat Trevor's last comment as sort of a segue. So Trevor sort of indicated this is really hard, and it's actually a lot more work than sort of implying there was something else. So I'm going to segue to Trevor to tell us kind of your thoughts here. Is there an alternative or other alternatives you're thinking of?
I guess what I'm just going through. I'm managing all the scenarios of what will need to happen. And granted, I do take a more bleak scenario, but I'm okay with that because I'd rather not. I'd rather be happy about it now and I hate my life down the road. For example, say we're going to support these different VMs. Does that mean we include their source code in the repository as well, just as we've done with V8s? Or do we, and how many different builds of Node do we release now from the official Node.js website, right?
I don't think that's really the end goal, right? I think probably what's more likely is that we'll be able to, at least eventually, we might include V8 for now and continue to do that for the foreseeable future. I think the end goal might be, and I might be speaking out of turn, but it's an eventual scenario that I could see, so I don't want to say that this is the end goal by any means. But I could imagine a world where, Node is shipped as a binary, or however we choose to distribute it, and, you can select your drivers, which can be binaries. They can be, shared objects or DLLs, however you're loading those binaries. That Node knows how to reason about and load at runtime, and it's strictly a matter of, you can do that build on the system, but the runtimes act like drivers, for lack of a better word.
So it would actually be good, I think, to help describe to everybody kind of that sort of vision by kind of filling in some of those blanks too, right? So, and however you end up kind of framing the discussion here, which either be an issue or maybe just a markdown document. But I mean, we got a bazillion questions. There will be a bazillion more, but at least we can kind of go over some of those known things in there.
Yeah, I can take some notes.
Great. But Trevor, did you have any other thoughts on any other kind of approaches here, or?
Yeah, I was thinking it'd be more actionable. Like we could start to release something out to the public more quickly and start to get them more involved with the API working group and care about what we're doing. If we were to start by doing something like, say, one thing that I've wanted to see done for a while is to consolidate the Node API into a single header. Right now, it's a flippin' mess. Technically, anything that has the Node extern macro in front of it is considered public, but you can include anything from any header from the source directory and use it if you want, if it works. Right? It's a mess the way it's set up, and so cleaning that up and getting like an actual official header with the official quote unquote APIs for native would be useful. The second thing would be to take these APIs as they're being discussed for the abstraction between JavaScript and V8 and create a user-facing API that sits on top of V8 for the time being. That can be done more quickly, it's a lot more flexible, and we can release it sooner so that users can get a feel for it and give us feedback, right? Going down the road of creating an API that abstracts V8 from JavaScript really locks us in and cements us into a single way of doing something. And if we don't get enough feedback early on, we'll probably get some bad flack down the road. And so by getting early feedback, we'll be able to get a better feel of how the existing community thinks it should work.
So what does that user-facing library look like? What kind of are you talking about? Like maybe V8 functions kind of exposed into JavaScript space, or?
No, I mean like we could. Okay, so the exact APIs that have been discussed for the abstraction between V8 and JavaScript are going to be the same exact type of APIs that will need to be exposed to the user, right? And so by simply taking those APIs, like we're talking about how those APIs should look, and then it would basically be like a beta run for the API by putting it in the user-facing API. And here's another advantage, that if we can get people to start moving over to that API, then if the abstraction ever does take over between V8 and JavaScript, they're already set, right? So when that happens, people are already on the API that will be needed to use the other VMs.
So what cases do they use that API, just to make it more concrete in my mind?
At this point, it would basically be a NAN, but it would be a little bit more ABI stable. Like it can't be ABI stable forever. That's impossible. But it can be more ABI stable than NAN. It can be a lot more API stable than NAN, and it can be included in Node Core.
Right. Do they still, like, what I'm trying to understand is it like native module writers that use the API or somebody else?
Yes, native module writers. I mean, in the end, that's who we have to appeal to anyway, right?
Right. So I'm just trying to understand the difference between saying we want to define an API that the native module writers will use and what we just described.
That's like, okay. So what I'm talking about is the API that's been discussed for abstracting V8 and JavaScript, right? And then an API, how do I put this? There are a lot of things that Node is currently doing that will require a lot of deep thought, right? Like, for example, recently added is the ability to know when an object is garbage collected, or when certain objects are garbage collected. Pretty sure not all VMs have that capability, right? And so those things will have to be punted. In my opinion, it'd be easier to get just the header file, just the user-facing header file, and don't touch core, right? Because touching the core source is going to get a lot more, like, people are going to kick against that a lot more than just writing a header file.
Right. So I think if I can try and play back is what you're saying is, let's not change what Node uses. Node continues to use the V8 APIs directly, but we would define an API which is what the modules would use.
Yes, and that is the same API that we would want to use to eventually abstract V8 from JavaScript.
Yeah, that I agree. Like I think everybody would be very happy if there was an API that stayed consistent and didn't change release to release, even if it that only applied to modules.
Yeah, I'm absolutely on board with that, and in fact, that's the real side of the problem that I'm interested in solving. I think, to your point, I think it's a real headache to try and imagine doing all of the guts change right now. But if we had a good abstraction over the JavaScript APIs that we could then just give to native module developers, you could see those two things are they're orthogonal problems, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one's good groundwork for the other. So, but yeah, no, I'm 100% in agreement that if we just defined an API that would be, this is just for modules, forget any other impacts, but this is the API that we think you should use for modules, and we think we can keep consistent across V8 releases. That's a good smaller piece, at least. It's still not easy, but it's a good a good starting point.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense to me, and to some extent, I think the previous discussion with Ogas is it's almost like these are, it's not quite, but like bottom up versus top down kind of, or coming at it from different directions. So I don't think like there's one necessarily like better or worse than the other. It's same problem space, kind of looking at it different ways. And if we got folks that want to go down both, let's do it. So it sounds like at least we should come up with kind of two separate issues here, or documents in terms of kind of getting started on these, make sure they're kind of described well so that somebody, I guess primarily like module authors, native module authors, could hopefully make some sense of and understand the value and what's trying to go on. So I will kind of bug people, I think, over the next month or so to try to get that stuff kicked off. Did we want to talk about any, go in any more depth there? There was 20 minutes left on the call. There were two other items on the agenda. Well, not really. The last one was let's come up with some standalone chunks to iterate on, which I'm saying I'll try to help get that formed. There's one other agenda item that had to do with FFI, and that was Alexis at least had chimed in on there. And so do you want to take a few minutes?
Sure. Sorry, I just disconnected and reconnected. So yeah, for the sake of providing this abstraction that is API stable and ABI stable between modules and Node. So the current approach, we expose a lot of the V8 internals. That's obviously part of the problem. We're talking about an abstraction that would abstract the engine features in a way that they don't depend so much on the V8 API, but they're more abstract. The idea behind the FFI approach is an approach that would not expose the least amount possible of the engine feature. It wouldn't expose a way to check if a property is available on an object. It would just be based on a way to invoke native methods from JavaScript. So you would define a signature of a C method, basically, and the mechanism will provide a glue to invoke this native method. And the assumption is that with this simple mechanism that just marshals basic types, you'll be able to implement the vast majority of modules. And it will be inherently portable and API stable. And I think there was some perception, there's some perception in the community that this approach is slow inherently, but I don't think that needs to be the case. And there was an approach proposed by Jeffrey Kaiser of Chakra using templates and leveraging the compiler to provide the glue for the native method invocation.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm kind of a big fan of FFI. I'm also sensitive to concerns about the performance, but you know, it's one of those things where there's sort of clearly some use of natives where the overhead, which is measured, at least last time I did experiments in, so it's sub-millisecond, but it's not sub-microsecond. So,
in the experiment by Jeffrey, to do a very simple add 2 ins, the overhead was 1% over a standard current method. I mean,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, in any case, I'm a big fan of FFI because I've used it in the past. Not so much with JavaScript, but I think that's actually a fine solution for some people, especially people who aren't familiar necessarily with C++. It looks to me like we kind of, I mean, I guess my feeling here is that you know, Nate has the FFI. He's been playing with this FFI stuff for a while, and there's even some issues in Node, and he has a link to them in the API issue 10 that points to 4 different FFI issues just within the Node repo itself. So, you know, I think to me this is kind of a done deal. It's like if we can actually get it into core, then it provides another alternative for people who want to be able to access native stuff and who are willing to put up with, you know, whatever overhead that kind of entails by using FFI. So it seems to me like this is kind of a big chunky bit that maybe some folks here who have an interest could actually, you know, press a little bit more to try to get this into core, and maybe we could have hold on.
To be included in a core, Nate already opened an FFI PR, and it was rejected because it touched too many other areas. FFI is a huge security concern for enterprise customers, and so we, the CTC, like, not officially, but it was somewhat agreed that if FFI is included, it has to be included basically in its own module. And so if a company or user wants to disable it, there's a single location they can go to on startup and say die, and it'll be gone, and they don't have to worry about a user abusing FFI on their system.
So that's one of the things that has to be factored into this thing, right? So I'll make sure that gets added to that issue. That's not clear from the issue in the API repo. Maybe it is as part of the Node core discussion.
The other question I have is, which part of the original problem does libFFI help with?
We're talking about interface for native modules, right? An API for native modules.
Right. This is for, but so that doesn't. I mean, does that part change as V8 changes as well? You know, we have one in Node that you write to. I know the pain of people have to update their modules because V8 changed.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, as an example, the example that Jeffrey Kaiser showed me when I was starting to come into this space was, at some point V8 added an isolate pointer to all of it, or to many of its method signatures, right? And so it previously hadn't required that, and then it did. And so basically, modules broke as a result of that new pointer needing to be added as part of the method calls. The theory behind FFI is, of course, that it would abstract away those problems once FFI got updated, which it should be fast. I think that's kind of one of the overall goals of the abstraction layer, right? To avoid those kinds of breaks. And so, however it happens, whether it's through FFI or some other mechanism, that would be a good success. But yeah, I think that's, to answer your question, that's the kind of the scope of the problem.
Right, but it only addresses you're making a call from JavaScript to C as opposed to you're in C and you want to call back, right?
Well, that's one of the open questions. Do we need to provide a way for native code to re-enter JavaScript?
Right. I mean, that seems like that's an important part of that API design and the shape of the API from the perspective of the application. It seems like calling back into JavaScript would be a common occurrence, and it would be one of those places where we would want to have that capability, I would think.
Yeah. So I think one way that we could approach this is try to build a very simple prototype that has the basics, and make sure that it's performant, and keep it in a separate branch or in a prototype branch, and then try to rewrite the top X native modules in terms of this and see what's missing, basically, and iterate over this approach.
I mean, if somebody's willing to put the work in, I'd like to see that.
I'm willing to put some work in this, and probably Rob can help, and whoever else wants to help.
Yeah, this is really kind of one of my charter areas for work. So yeah, that would definitely be something I would put work into.
Yeah, I can certainly help out a little bit. I played with Nate's FFI before, and like I said, I've used it in other languages. And by the way, it does have some callback capabilities. I can't remember exactly what they were. I was a little surprised to see that there were some.
Though Nate's FFI does something that I don't think all VMs do. He takes advantage of the fact that with buffers, you can be notified when the object's about to be garbage collected, so that the memory can be recovered.
Yeah, I still need to have that buffer conversation with you, Trevor. So I can actually talk intelligently about buffers. So yeah, it's kind of crazy because that FFI package just uses buffers as its allocated memory, which to me is just kind of like, what the what?
Yeah, it's actually pretty ingenious.
But also, it also adds methods to buffer, right? Which that's maybe not kosher. So one of the things maybe we need to look at is, hey, using buffers, that's kind of handy, but maybe actually what we need is kind of a separate memory model and this is actually not part of the FFI. It's another thing called ref, which goes along with FFI, and it's the memory allocation bit that Nate has worked on. And structurally, it's very good, and it's very similar to what I've seen in other FFIs. But it's just weird that it uses buffer. But it seems like maybe you don't want to necessarily use buffer, but have kind of a new allocated type. I think that's probably a good sub-exploration point in the FFI. And
I think the point of using buffer is that it's like all it does is hold a void pointer with a length, and it lets you know when it gets cleaned up. The fact that it exposes the only difference between that basic functionality and buffer is that buffer allows you to view the memory via array index. If you were to take that out, then like that's probably exactly what you're thinking ref would need, right?
Well, what my immediate question when I saw he was using buffer is, well, that must mean every time I allocate a buffer, there's heap allocated memory that never gets moved. And there's nothing in buffer, I don't think, that would lead me to indicate that that's true. But the fact that he used it that way, right? Because I can kind of put pointers to other buffers in a buffer.
Oh no. All allocations to buffer are external to the V8 heap.
Today.
Forever.
Right?
Forever. They have to be. In fact, when we upgraded to typed arrays, we actually forcefully set a flag on startup to tell V8, do not ever allocate within your heap.
Right, but all I'm saying is the current API for buffer itself doesn't really force like an implementation detail like that has to be non-movable memory. I don't think. But the usage by ref in FFI does force that, and so that's where I was like, this doesn't seem quite right to me. Anyway, that seems like a good discussion point, and maybe I can actually try to drill into that to actually learn how buffer works. It'll be so nice. Okay.
Well, happy to talk with you.
And the other thing I was just going to mention about FFI is, I have used it in the past with other languages, so I could probably at least, maybe point out some good things to look at versus other things like probably don't want to do file I/O, but like databases are great because they end up being kind of slowish anyway, so the overhead doesn't really matter, and and people doing, wanting to use something like Oracle that may only have binary. C APIs, having to do a native module for that can be time consuming, and FFI might be a big help there. So I'll be watching the FFI discussion then. Okay, so I think we've worked through the agenda, and we're 6 minutes early. So anything else anybody wanted to talk about for a few minutes? So what I'm going to do is I'll go back over and create some minutes. And like I said, I think I can. I'll either work with some folks to get some issues created, or just create some, and that we can kind of maybe focus a little bit more on. The next possibility for a meeting would be like mid-January. Is that? I don't think we could possibly do it any earlier because it's going to run into Christmas. But is that okay? People think they want to do 3 months between calls. Wait for some other interesting activity before we have a call.
I think January would be good.
Okay.
Yeah, I think otherwise we need a reminder to do stuff.
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody about one of the other calls I'm on, and they thought the calls were too frequent. But I sort of feel like having those calls is a reason to kind of go back over the information, even if it might just be a day or two before. But to kind of keep it in my mind anyway a little bit. So I'll plan on doing that then. And with that, I think we are done, unless anybody has anything else they'd like to add. All right, so thanks everyone for coming. Like I said, I'll post the minutes sometime tomorrow, next week, something like that. And have great holidays coming up soon, and talk to you in January.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.